It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. The Prime Minister faces more calls to suspend candidates being investigated over election bets.
It's the middle of an election campaign and Rishi Sunak needs to show some leadership. If these were my candidates, I'll tell you what, they'd be gone.
Also today, what are the parties proposing on childcare? This mum and full-time worker has been looking at the manifestos. J.K. Rowling says Labour has abandoned women. We examine the party's evolving position on gender-based rights.
The British people have spoken and the answer is we're out.
And 8 years after this, what are the parties saying now about Brexit? Joining us today, Health Minister Andrea Leadsom, Shadow Business Minister Sarah Jones, columnist for the Sunday Telegraph Zoe Strimple, and Labour's former leader in Scotland, Kezia Dugdale. This is Politics Live Election 2024. Well, let's start with the story about the Gambling Commission's inquiry into alleged bets placed on the date of the general election by some Conservative candidates and party officials. Our political editor, Chris Mason, has now found that more people than the four names so far are being looked into by the Commission. And Chris joins us now out in the sunshine. What do we know about the inquiry so far, Chris?
Yeah, afternoon to you, Jo Coburn. That's the big news, isn't it, of this election campaign? The sun's finally come out 5 and a bit weeks in. I've managed to abandon my jacket as well as my coat for at least the next few minutes. So, yeah, where are we on the whole betting saga? Well, the Prime Minister in just the last couple of minutes has been talking to reporters in Edinburgh. He's in Scotland this lunchtime launching the Conservative Scottish manifesto, and he has said to reporters that he's not aware of any other Conservative candidates being looked into in regard to all of this. What I understand from the 1,000,001 phone calls I've been making over the weekend is that there are more people being looked into connected to the Conservatives and the wider government than we currently know about publicly. So that's where we are, with the prospect, therefore, that there could be, I say could, it's not certain, but there could be a drip of further revelations in the days to come, which is obviously irritating to plenty of Conservatives who'd much rather be talking about, well, frankly, anything else.
Right, and Chris, there are increasing number of calls for the Prime Minister to suspend any candidates once the inquiries are ongoing, of course, but there are calls for him to suspend them now.
There are those within the party, privately and indeed publicly, one or two, who would like to see those candidates be effectively disowned by the party. Now, the nature of where we are in the cycle of this general election is that the names of candidates and their party affiliation are, if not set down in stone, then certainly set down on paper. In other words, they're on ballot papers that are going out to postal voters right now and will be in polling stations in 10 days' time. So in that sense, nothing can change. But it doesn't stop a party, and we've seen this in this campaign and indeed in previous ones, disowning a candidate if they so choose to do so. Now, the view of the Prime Minister is no. There are processes underway that should be allowed to run their course. In the view of one Cabinet Minister talking to the BBC this morning, people are innocent until proven otherwise, and that's why things should be allowed to continue as they are. But critics within the party and beyond are saying, well, hang on a minute, no, perhaps the only way to turn a leaf on this is for the party to, in the thrust of an election campaign with barely any time to go, act more boldly, as they would see it. But as things stand, the government Prime Minister this lunchtime, in that huddle as it's known of with reporters in the last few minutes, sticking to the view that they remain candidates who are fully endorsed, not just on the piece of paper, but by the party at the top rank.
Chris, can I ask you a question on a different story? It's the ongoing row about Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform, his comments about the war in Ukraine. In an interview with the BBC, he suggested that the West provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine by expanding eastwards. He's been criticised for this by both Labour and the Conservatives. But I just want to show our guests on the panel and our viewers this tweet from the Conservative Party's chairman, Richard Holden. It says, Conservatives have always been on the side of the people who told the USSR power to tear down the Berlin Wall. And you can see there an image of Margaret Thatcher and the then US President Ronald Reagan, who, of course, worked towards, as they saw it, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Underneath is a picture of Nigel Farage being knighted, it seems, on Russia Today in some sort of mock-up. Where is this going?
So Nigel Farage, a new granddad this weekend, he was putting on social media earlier on. Where is it going? It's going to an interesting strategic place, I think, in this campaign, because up until the last couple of days, the Conservatives in particular, and Labour to an extent too, as well as the other parties, in their public pronouncements have pretty much tried to ignore reform, or certainly not go directly for Nigel Farage. I think from the Conservative perspective, there was a sense up until the last few days of the potential danger of doing that, which is that you might alienate further potential voters who could be wooed back to the Conservative course, who might be flirting with Reform UK. Well, that strategy stopped after that interview between Nigel Farage and Nick Robinson, because as you can see from that social media post that you were just showing us just there, the Conservatives in particular think that those remarks through the night from Nigel Farage create a point of difference that they can hammer home around patriotism, ultimately, and the degree to which people support the UK's outlook on Ukraine. Now, Nigel Farage has attempted to clarify his remarks from the other night. He wrote a piece in the Telegraph over the weekend saying he absolutely, wholeheartedly condemns Vladimir Putin, but trying to make that argument that the actions of NATO and the European Union might have been a contributory factor in leading to that conflict. So a really interesting point of difference there between the Conservatives and Reform, with Reform still doing very well for an upstart party in the opinion polls, and frightening plenty of Conservatives as we head into this final week.
Chris Mason, thank you very much. Let's talk, first of all, about the Gambling Commission's inquiries that you heard Chris Mason outlining. Andrea, I will come to you for a remark in just a moment, but let's listen to what your colleague, Tobias Elwood, had to say on the Today programme this morning.
Let's give the nation greater reassurance that I think it wants to see to ensure this never happens again. Let's introduce clear rules, as you have in the banking world and in the city, connected to the purchase of stocks and shares, for example. Let's prevent any current politician or party professional from placing any bets in the future.
Andrea, do you agree with him?
Well, having got very involved early in my parliamentary career in the LIBOR rigging, if you remember, post the banking scandal, I absolutely agree that any kind of insider trading of any sort is absolutely reprehensible and disgraceful. And so it may well be the case that in future we need to look again at what the rules are, generally speaking, in the public space. But where this is in particular concerned, this is a shockingly bad story, and it's devastatingly bad timing because we're right in the throes of a general election. However, the fact is people are innocent until proven guilty. So it makes
and you don't think they should be suspended, the candidates who are being looked into by the Gambling Commission?
I think, like when Angela Rayner was being investigated by the police and people called for her to be suspended or to lose her job, and quite rightly, Keir Starmer said no, innocent till proven guilty. The same is true here. You know, we can't have one rule when it's a general election, another rule when it's not. And actually, on the face of it, there is nothing illegal about gambling. But we all agree
there is if there's insider information. But just broadly, as you say, in the middle of an election campaign, should people be placing bets, candidates or officials, Conservative officials?
At best, it was a complete error of judgment on anyone to place a bet.
And
of course, at worst, it's criminal. And as the Prime Minister have said, anyone found guilty of anything criminal will be immediately thrown out of the party and will face the full force of the law.
Would Labour ban current politicians and political insiders from making political bets?
Well, it's already illegal to put a bet on a Shaw prospect. It's already illegal. So the key here is that those people who have placed bets should be suspended. Rishi Sunak needs to do the right thing. It's not the same as Angela Rayner, because in that situation, Angela said, I am absolutely clear, I have done absolutely nothing wrong. We do not know that about these candidates. We do not know. We think that they placed the bet, but they haven't answered the question.
One of them did, because he said it was a terrible error of judgment.
But they haven't answered, did they know in advance that the election was going to be called? And the question is, would Angela be happy campaigning for those people out on the streets, asking people to vote for them, or not? And if the answer is no, they really should be suspended.
Would you be happy party campaigning for them?
Well, number one, I'm Andrea, not
Yeah,
Angela.
no, well,
that's all right. Angela Rayner is the deputy leader of the Labour Party. So I think it is a terrible story, and at best, it's an terrible.
But the question is, would you be happy campaigning on their
so
behalf?
Someone is innocent until proven guilty.
So you would?
I would not be going out campaigning for somebody who was under that cloud, but I would, at the same time, I do think people are innocent until proven guilty. It's a fundamental principle.
All right, Zoe, what do you think in terms of a sort of blanket ban on candidates, political insiders placing bets on things like the general election timing?
Right, so I think this is an absolutely classic example of where our political culture has sort of gone down the tubes, which is that something that is so obviously, brings parties into disrepute, that is morally repugnant, that is basically uncivil to engage in such blatant insider trading, requires more rules. So it's rules, bans. It's like people have zero sense of how to behave without more regulation. Maybe we do need that regulation. Clearly, this kind of thing, it's sort of, as Andrea said, I mean, it's such a terrible, judgment call that maybe people need to.
Yeah, but we don't yet know, of course, of the insider. That
right,
is the key.
We don't know. But
people placing bets is different, but what I'm saying is, should they just ban everyone placing bets at all to avoid any?
No, I actually think this could end up being an important question, because that is a slippery slope to the sense that maybe gambling should be banned entirely, things like that. What I wanted to just point out about this story, though, is Michael Gove's comments about the equivalent with Partygate. And I actually think they're not similar. And I know I have an incredibly unpopular view of this, but I think Partygate was a huge, basically, fuss about relatively little. If you look at what leaders in other countries were doing, the fact that people were having cake and wine, I mean, is that lots of people were doing that as well.
But you think this is a bit...
And I think this is a completely different moral paradigm. I think this is much more akin to something that might look like corruption. We don't know, obviously, the end result. Whereas I think the Partygate thing was just, oh my God, everyone's under.
All right.
I don't know. I think it's a different kind of thing. So I don't agree with those comments.
Kezia.
I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with politicians putting on bets, as long as those bets are gambles, right? You have to think that there's a chance you could lose.
You don't have an fair advantage.
Absolutely. I think there's a much bigger issue here, which is about the psyche of the Conservative Party. So this is a historic moment, an election has been called, and the reaction of senior figures in the Conservative Party was to work out how to make a quick buck. That tells us an awful lot about the party.
No, not since it was called, Kezia. It was before it was called. And you're absolutely right. There's nothing inherently wrong with bets. The question is whether they knew at the time the date that was proposed, in which case it would be criminal. Well, we don't exactly know who is under question. We know one person.
Well, we know a number of people.
But said it was an error of judgment.
There was a flurry of bets leading up to
there was a spike.
The Prime Minister called the election in the country. That is worth interrogation.
Of course,
we know the people that did that were senior Conservative figures. What this sounds very much like, and what the investigation is going to demonstrate, is that they were on a promise. They knew what was going to happen, and that's the difference between a gamble and insider trading.
Right,
that's what speaks to the psyche of the party.
We will continue to follow this story, of course, over the next few weeks, up until polling day at the very least. Now, let me bring you up to date with Nick Robinson's Panorama interviews, because he continues his series of interviews with the party leaders, and he'll be joined by the Green Party's co-leader, Adrian Ramsey, tonight at 7 o'clock on BBC One and the iPlayer. Let's have a look at an important issue, part of the political context of this election and, of course, contained in the manifestos, and it's what the main parties are offering on childcare and early years. A couple of months ago, we spoke to Therese Biani-Moa on Politics Live to discuss this issue, specifically the expansion of the government's free childcare hours policy. And she joins us now again, I'm pleased to say, from her home in Northamptonshire. Therese, first of all, just tell us a little bit about your family and where you are with childcare arrangements.
Of course. I'm a full-time working mum of two girls. I've got a daughter 6 and 2. I currently, like I said, work full-time, including a commute of 3 days a week into London to do this. My husband also works full-time. Our nursery fees are currently coming in at 12 grand a year, which means we pay more than our mortgage each month on childcare. And our nursery was forced to go fully private with the 2-year-old scheme that was run out, because they currently face a huge deficit every year created by the underfunded historic 3-year-old funding. So although the 2-year-old funding does cover their daily rate, they cannot offer one without the other.
Right.
We've been unable to find another setting to accommodate us that does offer the funding, because all the nurseries in the local area that do, it's either term time only, they don't provide wraparound care, or they are too far away for us to consider.
OK, right. Well, let's just remind our guests and our viewers of what is in the Conservative Party manifesto. It says give working parents 30 hours of free childcare a week from when their child is 9 months old to when they start school, saving eligible families an average of £6,900 per year. I think we can show what's in the Labour manifesto too. As an initial step, Labour will open an additional 3,000 nurseries through upgrading space in primary schools to deliver the extension of government-funded hours families are entitled to, which we've just heard. What do you make of the two pledges?
If I'm honest, I think they're both quite disappointing. I think if I start with the Conservative manifesto, I think the fact that they're going to just continue with their current scheme when we already know that 3-year-old funding is underfunded, we need to know, is that being reviewed? Is that being looked at? Will that be revised in any way? You know, any good business will always roll out their plan and continually look at it and revise it. And I don't feel like that's the case with the Conservative Party. I know that they've also said that they're going to have an estimated 500 million extra funding over the rates for the next 2 years. But where is that going to come from? Will that cover the 3-year-old funding, or is that only to cover the new schemes that are coming out over the next couple of years? And then I think with the Labour Party, I've got to be critical of that as well, because the idea is it's a bold statement, but without any details. I mean, I don't know. Our current primary school where my daughter attends, they're screaming out for more space. So I don't know what primary schools have got spare classrooms and also, again, how is that going to be funded? How is that going to be staffed? We already know that nurseries are understaffed, and we know that the Conservative incentive that they recently rolled out wasn't successful.
All right.
How are all these things going to be addressed?
Well,
we need more detail.
We have two people who may be able to help you, Andrea and Sarah, from the Conservative and Labour parties, respectively. First of all, Andrea, listening to Therese, it just doesn't sound like your offering is viable.
Well, it is absolutely viable, and what we have said is we're rolling this out quite carefully. So from this September, it'll be 15 hours of free childcare for 9 months and up. And then to 2025, September 25, that will rise to 30 hours. Absolutely critical to this is both the supply side, i.e. getting more nursery workers into the sector, hence rolling it out over a period of time, because you do need more staff to run the nurseries. But also what the Conservatives have done is significantly increase the funding available for both 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, and pledged a further £500 million, all fully costed in our budget last year. So this isn't a manifesto, this was budgeted last year. So all set out over the next 5 years. But what I would say is, you know, it was Conservatives who in 2015, set out the first fully funded free childcare hours. And it's recognising actually the benefit to the economy, because obviously what our plans will do, according to the OBR, is to generate tens of thousands more people able to go back to work, who want to have that proper work-life balance.
I understand that, but it's the viability. I mean, Therese, listening to that, is that going to help your situation?
No, because we've never been able to access a full 30 hours. I don't know any parent who has, because even when our nurseries have been able to offer the free hours, they're not free. They all come with a top-up fee that you have to voluntarily contribute, because the funding that the government provides does not cover their day rate. Our nursery has a deficit of £32,000 a year generated by the underfunded 3-year-old funding, and that is why they are no longer able to offer this scheme.
Andrea, just quickly respond and then I'll come on to Sarah.
Well, I'd just be interested to know from Teresa and whether you think that it's unreasonable for there to be any top-up. I mean, as you've said, your fees at the moment are £12,000 a year for your 2 gorgeous little girls. And do you feel that effectively the taxpayer should fund that completely, or do you think it's reasonable that there are certain top-up fees? So, for example, in the special needs space, I know a lot of parents would like to go for a specialist school and would be happy to pay top-up fees to get that extra one-to-one support that they feel they need.
I think the problem is the word free, isn't it, in the childcare? But we can come back to that. I mean, Sarah, you never really believed in this scheme anyway. You criticised it. I mean, back in March, your Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, said the system was a total mess. And she said Labour wouldn't commit to the plan, that the current system isn't equipped to deal with the extra demand. But now you are going to continue with it.
Well, what we're faced with is the most expensive childcare in Europe.
So scrap it.
We have parts of the country where there are 5 people waiting for every place that there is.
So what are you going to do?
And we have a system where, very well described, where the incentives are not there, the money is not there for nurseries to stay open, and it will get more complicated. So we're saying 2 things. The first is 3,000 nurseries providing 100,000 places.
Funded by?
Funded by the private school VAT. So that we will be able to go back to the level of childcare provision that we had at the end of the last Labour government, just in terms of numbers. Now, of course, that doesn't solve the wider problem of the cost, and we need to, what we have said and what we have asked is David Bull, the former Permanent Secretary, has been doing a big piece of work looking at the future funding of early years.
Yeah, but that hasn't been completed,
which,
has it? I think it's David Bell.
Was due to be finished in the autumn, when we thought that there would be
an
election in the autumn.
All right.
But we will work on that.
Hang on.
What we cannot do is make sort of radical changes, because the sector is very vulnerable. There are people who are trying to run a nursery on very little money.
Let me because that's a completely different subject. It may be related, but it is a different subject for today on childcare. I just want to go back to Therese to get a response on Labour's plan, continuing with what the Conservatives are suggesting and these 3,000 nurseries in primary schools.
I just don't know where you're going to find that space. I mean, I'm an active member of my daughter's PTA at her school, and we're actually fundraising to build additional classroom space. So I have absolutely no idea where you're going to find spare spaces in within primary schools, because they're all screaming out for additional space.
And particularly, just to come back on that, obviously it's not going to, in your particular school, that's the case, but there are lots of schools in where I live, for example, where because the birth rate has fallen, they do have spare space and they do have spare classroom space. And this is a way that we can start to do what they do in other countries, where you join up the early years with the primary school to get a better, more seamless, more comprehensive provision for our young people.
I mean, this is complicated and it is expensive when you just look at comparisons, and both parties are trying to address that issue. But what do you think broadly about the principle of the state expanding into this area anyway?
The state probably needs to expand into this area anyway, as part of any sort of economic policy that makes sense, because obviously it's not just an issue in isolation, it's about women re-entering the workforce. So the issue, I suppose, is that, you know, there's a long history to the state's approach to children, and it hasn't always been the one that we would necessarily want. Do I want the state determining about, you know, every interaction that my child will have, regulating every sort of waking hour they have? But I think the real problem is the state in a position to quickly come up with a way that parents will feel comfortable with who these people are who are looking after their children for all these hours. Because it's one thing to say, right, we're going to create lots more jobs, get people in. This is an incredibly sensitive job. I mean, there's zero room for error. There can't be any, you know, each scandal costs a child's well-being. So it's actually much more sensitive than people are making out. However, I do think that if those problems can be ironed out, I think there's a lot of potential here. I think having the ability to afford, and it does make a big difference, to send your child to more nursery allows women to then get back into the workforce. And especially now, post-COVID, there is more flexible working. It opens up a lot more options. And I would say that there is that thing about, it also where I live, there's a lot of under-subscribed primary schools because of patchy forecasts to do with population. Right. So I think there's a real potential, actually, in what Labour is suggesting to carry on from what the Conservatives have suggested.
All right, let me just get Kezia in first.
The mistake here is to think about this as free hours that one individual is entitled to, and to commodify it in a retail politics way like that. The countries who do this really well and have less inequality than we have in the United Kingdom treat nurseries like they treat schools. It's a community institution, it's a community asset, it's there for you, it's funded by the state, and you can draw down on it when you need it. I went to Finland when I was Labour's education spokesperson. Facilities there, yes, they pay more tax, but the facilities there are open from 6 a.m. in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. High quality, affordable That's what matters. It's not about free hours. It's about community assets people can draw down when they need them.
Well, Therese, would you be prepared to pay more in income tax to fund the sort of nursery provision that Kezia has just outlined?
Absolutely. And actually, to address Andrea's point earlier, I've absolutely no problem paying a top-up fee either. The issue is it's voluntary, which means if parents choose not to pay it, the nurseries are let down. They can't enforce that payment. But absolutely, I think if we could get a scheme in place, the same way our counterparts in a lot of countries in Europe have, it is only going to benefit the whole economy. It's not just working mums either. I would like to address that. It is working parents. It is not just working mums. This affects all working parents. And if we get a robust, reliable, high quality childcare that is affordable, it benefits the entire economy and the entire country, not just those who have kids.
Yeah. I completely agree with you, and I just
but Therese doesn't think that's what you're offering.
Well, no, I'm agreeing with her that having high quality childcare, and that is what this free childcare is designed. This is a supply side move to encourage many more nurseries to start up, to take on more staff. I'd just like to put in a good word for our Family Hubs programme, because we're growing Family Hubs right across England to be a one-stop shop for families who have a new baby, or indeed a child up to age 19 or 25 where there's disabilities, and that will be a community-based place where to get information to improve the quality of support for families with young children.
Oh yeah, well, Sarah, would
vital.
Labour continue that?
Can I just say, on this business of VAT on school fees,
Andrea, we haven't really got time.
In the special needs area, there are so many parents who scrimp and save to put their child into not an expensive, but a small, relatively low-cost private school because they have special needs. What on earth are Labour going to do?
Sarah, do you want to answer?
Spare classrooms. They're going to have thousands of more children.
If you've got an EHCP, you won't pay the extra costs would definitely not apply to that school.
The school would be
so the cost would not go on the school. On the point about your family hubs, I think that Wes has said, you know, we'll obviously look to do what works, and we'll look at that. And I know you're keen to work with us in the future on potentially developing that.
All right, we're going to move on. Thank you very much, first of all, though, to Therese for joining us again, and we'll come back to you, no doubt, after the election. Let's have a look at this headline in The Times. Labour to simplify undignified gender transition process. This is about gender recognition. What exactly are you going to do? How are you going to simplify it?
Well, the first thing to say is this isn't a new thing. This has been the policy for a while. So we have said a number of things. One is that you will still need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria in order to make that transition. And the diagnosis is really important, and that is absolutely key. And we are balancing that alongside then the process of how you transition, balancing that alongside the rights of women to their safe spaces.
Well, what's the difference between what the current situation is?
Well, so at the moment you have to have a diagnosis. We have a specialist medical officer who will make that diagnosis instead of this panel that exists now.
Okay.
And then you have to wait for 2 years.
You'll still have to wait 2 years.
You will still have to wait 2 years, but we will make that process less bureaucratic and less difficult for those individuals involved. And I think, you know, just to the article about J.K. Rowling that you referred to at the start of the programme, I think...
Well, you can see it here. Yes, she says Labour has turned its back on women.
You know, this shows us that we have a long way to go to try and build relationships, to try and make sure we are having a conversation with people that they feel is open and honest and that can bring people alongside one another to come up with a solution. There has to be a better process in terms of gender dysphoria and that.
But I think a lot of people think that the Labour Party has sort of changed its position or its tone on this issue.
It's also perplexing, given that this is such an emotive issue for so many women, biological women, of which they are the vast majority of voters. Why would Labour be making a thing of this now? I just don't understand. It's a tiny proportion of people that may stand to so-called benefit from this, and the downsides are huge. Why shouldn't they have to go through more bureaucracy? I don't understand, given that the fact that when this goes wrong, women massively have to suffer. If you're going to transition, you should be treated with dignity. You should not be discriminated against. But I don't think it's too much to ask. I don't think it's dehumanizing that a panel would be looking at your case, because you know what's going to happen when it's just a medical officer. Maybe you're going to appoint someone and they're going to be vetted, but over time there'll be a system where some doctors will become known as easy ones with a soft touch, and everyone will go to them, and the problem will just keep going. It just seems so unpopular. It just seems so out of touch with what women want. And J.K. Rowling was bang on in her article, and it's people. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to add anything positive to the majority.
Well, I mean, as I said, this story isn't a new one. It's just something that the Times have reported.
Yeah.
It's not something new that we've said.
It would be an opportunity to go back on it and to show commitment.
But I think what we have said and been really clear about is that this will be a consultation, that we will not just sort of bring in something overnight, that we want to talk to people.
Why do this
We want
at all?
to do something in a common sense way that works for people.
Because minority rights matter. And
let Kezia respond.
I just don't. I'd be amazed.
You give me more than 3 seconds to make a point. You can take it on, sure. So minority rights matter. I was a politician who met many trans people who were in the most awful circumstances, denied the most basic health care. That's at the root of this. I'm a feminist. I'm an LGBT activist. I don't see that there's an inconsistency between those two things. I think it's possible to respect gender rights and sex-based rights. Have we got some of this wrong in recent times? Absolutely. Is there a lot of work to do to get this right? 100%. But there is not two tribal corners to this debate that can't meet in the middle and work a way through that respects trans rights and also protects women's spaces. That is possible.
Well, I think there's a very plausible reaction to that, which is that this softening of the intrusiveness is actually a backdoor way of just making it self-ID. And I think that I think there's a false binary here, which is this idea that that it's undignified or it's a violation of trans people's human rights to expect a slightly more involved process. Now, that is being billed as dehumanizing, but it may not be dehumanizing. It may be a very decent way to conduct a very, very complicated process, which has huge social impact on everyone else in society.
Is it going to change it that much anyway, Kezia, this?
What it does is it takes away the requirement. Labour's policy, as I understand it, takes away the requirement that you'd have to evidence that you've lived as a woman for 2 years before that point. There would still be a medical element to the process. There's still a 2-year cooling off period. Crucially, what that does is resolves the problem we had in Scotland, where somebody like Isla Bryson was able to claim that they were a woman and access a female jail. Now, as somebody who backs trans rights, I found that abhorrent, and that is a problem that needs to be addressed. Labour in the manifesto have found a way to bring women together to find a route through this which respects women's rights, recognises both gender and sex. It's going to be very difficult to heal the wounds of division that this debate has caused, but this is a starting point and it should be recognised.
I'm just genuinely just ask one
more question, but then
I'm
I'll
just
get to Andrea.
genuinely unclear on why proof of living as in the adopted gender for 2 years is unacceptable.
Because beforehand, one of the things we did was say, well, does your Tesco club card call you by the gender that you use? I mean, that's ridiculous. How is that a piece of evidence? What we have here, though, is a 2-year process.
Maybe that's not a good piece of evidence, but maybe utility bills, maybe a full adoption of this law. I don't understand. I just don't think it's necessarily such a terrible thing to ask.
I think trans women and trans men deserve a better system than they're currently faced with. I think we can deliver that through public policy without jeopardising women's rights. I think there's a way through this.
Andrea, do you support what you've heard from Sarah and Kezia, not conflating the two names there, Sarah and Kezia, in terms of making the process, as Labour would argue, less intrusive and less bureaucratic, but still 2 years required?
So I fully support that trans people's rights should be upheld and protected. Absolutely support that. However, I agree with Zoe that it makes no sense to water down. And frankly, Labour have flip-flopped over this, as they have on so many things, because previously they wanted you to self-ID. Then they said that they would accept the idea that you could actually be assessed by a panel.
But what do you think about a less bureaucratic system?
OK, so what I think...
For a trans woman, for example, in order to change their sex legally.
So for me, my passion is all about early years and child protection, OK? And what I think we've seen, and I've seen some experience of it as a constituency politician, young people encouraged to think that they're in the wrong gender and to become extremely confused by that, extremely confused, and to have that constant affirmation, yes, 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 I'm sure you probably are the opposite sex, that confusion is something that we have to protect children from. So 18 for me is an absolute cut-off. And once you get to adults, you do have to countenance the risk of bad actors. We've seen it. There have been some very high-profile stories. So I actually think it's got to be good bureaucracy, and I wouldn't call it bureaucracy. I would call it safeguarding, both for that individual and for society at large. I think society has a right to protect itself as well as protect the rights of trans people.
Very briefly.
To Zoe's original point, you know, this isn't the biggest issue when it comes to safety of women, and Labour has a whole raft of policies about violence against women and girls, halving that, specialist rape courts, 999 call centres, all having domestic advice workers, also making sure that we've got more police on our streets. There is a whole raft of policies that are about protecting women that is also, you know, really important and forms one of the big missions that Keir Starmer's got in government.
All right, we're going to talk about Brexit and the SNP. Today is the 8th anniversary, you saw in the headlines there, of the Brexit decision in 2016, the UK leaving the EU. The vote took place on the 23rd of June, but the result was announced in the early hours of the 24th. Let's talk to Stephen Gethin, an SNP candidate. I haven't seen him for quite some time. Hello to you, Stephen. Just before I come to you, I was just going to show this headline in the Herald. Swinney, that's John Swinney, the First Minister. Brexit exposed myth of union of equals. What is the SNP's policy on the EU? What are you proposing the UK government at Westminster does?
Well, quite simply, is rejoin the European Union. And it's not just expose that inequality of union and the failures of the constitutional system. It's costing a fortune. You know, reports that came out showing it's cost 140 billion since that vote. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for small businesses in particular. It's bad for the rights that we've lost as UK citizens, that we took for granted previously. So it's not good for the economy. It's not good for us as citizens. So rejoin. I mean, the SNP also offered, as did others, a compromise previously of stay in the single market and the customs union.
Stephen,
we know from the Treasury that's the second best option.
But Stephen, as you know, none of the main parties is advocating that. So
It's a shame, isn't it?
I don't know. Is it a shame? Because in two recent in two recent opinion polls in Scotland, the percentages of people saying the EU Brexit discussion was an important issue measured 10% and 4%. So you're just talking about this to try and put pressure, probably particularly on Labour, on an issue that no one in Scotland, or very few people in Scotland, seem to be talking about, and is not on the agenda at this election.
With the greatest respect, Jo, I'm somebody who previously worked in the European institutions. I worked with colleagues cross-party to stop a no-deal Brexit when I was in Parliament previously. People care about the economy, they care about money for public services, they care about that Westminster consensus around Labour and the Conservatives and austerity. How do you grow your economy? You grow your economy by rejoining the European Union. That gives you resources for the NHS, it gives you resources for the other public services. Also in terms of migration, and you know there's been a bit, again, this really troubling consensus around Labour and the Conservatives around migration. If you're going to be treated in the NHS, you benefit from migration as well, given the skilled workers that you bring in, as well as the benefits that we enjoy as citizens to live, work and love across Europe.
You've set out your stall. My question is more about why you are doing it on the basis that, as I say, it's not in any of the other main parties, you may say it's a shame, manifestos. But can I just interject here, because we've heard from the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who is in Scotland for the launch of the Scottish Tories manifesto. Let's just have a listen to what he had to say.
Sure.
Every Scottish Conservative MP returned makes our United Kingdom stronger, and it sends a clear message. Scotland wants politicians who concentrate on the priorities of the Scottish people and not constitutional monomania.
Oh, Stephen Gethin, stop focusing on monomania.
Well, you know, you've just been criticising me for focusing on EU membership and the benefits that brings. Yes, the SNP is in favour of independence, a vote for the SNP, yes, a vote for independence, a vote to rejoin the EU, but also in a whole range of other areas, tackling the climate emergency, protecting the NHS as well. You know, parties stand on more than one issue at elections, and it's absolutely right to go back to your original question that we should be talking about Brexit even if Labour and the Conservatives aren't. I'm not going to avoid an issue just because it's difficult and a little bit awkward for our Labour and Conservative colleagues.
Let's get response from our guests in the studio. Andrea, you first of all.
Unbelievable. You know, why anybody says it would be a good idea to rejoin the EU. You know, in May, the UK was the joint highest growth in the G7, joint with Canada, that is, ahead of France and Germany. We're the world's 4th largest exporter. You know, Remainers who are still fed up, still fighting that democratic battle and the will of the people, argue that we've tanked since then. Rubbish. Even the beloved Office for National Statistics has had to re-evaluate.
It does depend where you put your statistics, of course, Andrea.
Well, no, it doesn't actually, Jo. The ONS said that our economy had shrunk, and then they revised it upwards to say our economy's grown, our employment is low. We didn't have to scrap the NHS.
Well, let Stephen.
The NHS let
Stephen respond.
Sorry, can I respond? I'm getting the same nonsense from Andrea that I was getting 8 years ago. The Office for Budget Responsibility showed the way in which it has shrunk. There is no economic report that shows benefits from leaving the EU. I'm sorry, but this kind of pushing, this anti-information that the Conservatives and other Brexiteers have been pushing out stands against what companies are actually experiencing. They're experiencing the blockages, particularly small businesses, and also about rights, about the rights that I enjoyed as a young person that young people do not enjoy. Surely, as politicians, we should leave more rights for those that come after us, not fewer rights. And Andrea wants to leave fewer rights. And I'm so sorry that whatever's happened, that the Labour Party now think that the Conservatives must have done so well that instead of backing single market and customs union membership as they did in the aftermath of the EU referendum 8 years ago, I wonder what's gone so right with a hard Tory Brexit that the Labour Party think that they should be following suit.
Sarah?
Well, we've been really clear. We're not going to reopen any arguments about the EU.
You are going to renegotiate the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement.
Join the single market, customs union, free movement. No, none of those things. What we do want is a grown-up, healthy relationship with our allies and our partners and our near neighbours who we want to trade with. And there are problems with trade. And I talk to people from different industries, including the car industry, about what those kind of burdens are in terms of bureaucracy. And we want to start with things like a kind of veterinary agreement and then the professional services alignment so that we can move things around without having that bureaucracy. But it's about having a grown-up relationships. It's about not saying that France is not necessarily a friend or foe and having this kind of childish relationship we've had in the past. But it's not about going back to a point where we're doing anything like customs union, single market or free movement.
And Michel Barnier says that free movement will be the price of any renegotiation.
Well, I'll come to that in a minute. But Stephen, do you want to respond to what you just heard from Sarah on Labour?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say this tinkering from the Labour Party is not only disappointing, but it's also highly damaging for business. I think saying things like a grown-up relationship is going to cut it. A grown-up relationship does not cut it for businesses that are struggling to export. A grown-up relationship does not cut it for educational institutions who are outside research partnerships, although some of that has been dealt with. A grown-up relationship does not cut the problems that have been caused by freedom of movement, and it does not tackle the problems that were highlighted by Sadiq Khan's report into how much economic damage that has been done based on Treasury assumptions, not anybody else's Treasury assumptions.
Labour has an entire manifesto built around growth and how we grow the economy, whether that's planning, housing, the National Wealth Fund, Great British Energy, our reform to skills. We are going to be completely committed to growing the economy, and we have ways to do that.
And we'll, of course, be scrutinising you on delivery.
That will be our approach if we're in government.
The thing is, economics and geopolitics are completely interlinked, and I think surely you must be troubled by the fact that the EU is being, or the dominant countries in the EU are being swept with far right politics that make our far right seem completely.
Rubbish.
Well, I mean,
that's nonsense. Can I counter that, please?
Well, yes. Is it nonsense?
I mean, let her finish her point.
France is incredibly unstable at this point. People think there could even be a civil war there. The anti-capitalist kind of vibe of the continent is, Barcelona's just banned Airbnbs and stuff. I just think, it's before we kind of say, Europe is this kind of economic heaven. I mean, I think there's a lot of. I mean, it's not a strange point to make that Europe is seeing the rise of far-right parties.
Let's
entering a new period of instability.
There has been a swing, hasn't there, Stephen, to some extent, to right-wing parties across the EU.
Do you know, but what's interesting, we talk about the far right in Europe. We've got far right parties in Europe who no longer advocate leaving the EU because the UK has been so unsuccessful. And we've got parties in the UK advocating things like leaving the European Convention of Human Rights. That's pretty far right. So when you're pointing fingers, we're more secure in the EU with energy security, food and drink security.
All right.
And you were not seeing anybody else leaving, so it's been a disaster.
Apologies to you, Kezia, for not letting you in. Thank you very much, Stephen Gethens, for joining us. From all of us here, bye-bye.